All right, so I want to talk about psychological biases today. And I want to talk about a crazy example of a psychological bias called default bias. And basically, it's the tendency to keep a choice as the default choice and not making that changes to that choice. And I want to give like one example of what I consider probably the most impactful from a revenue generation standpoint example of somebody, a company that is using the default bias to make Rishi like really crazy amount of money. Okay. And this company is Apple. So Apple is getting paid, I had to look it up. Apple is getting paid 12 billion with a B dollars a year to have Google as default browser on iPhone for Safari. So every time somebody buys a new iPhone, uses Safari, they click on the Safari icon and they get redirected to google.com as the favorite search engine. So that thing cost Google $12 billion. Isn't that crazy?
That's crazy. It's $1 billion a month. What's crazier about this is that obviously it's worth 5 times more to Google, right? So think about, I
Totally.
think I've read a statistic that said iPhone consumers are the richest in the world. So, their ad clicks are more valuable. I think it's a no-brainer.
And to add to the craziness of this, I took a look at Apple net income, which is about 60 billion a year. So 1/5 of that net income comes from this default bias.
That's even more amazing. That's crazy. That's crazy. And you know what's interesting? So I think what's really interesting here as well is that a lot of times brands might say something like Google might say like, in PPC, we have this dilemma where we say that, well, we don't want to be spending on our branded terms because we were going to get them anyway. And I think this is the counterpoint to that, right? Because Google could have said, well, 80% of these people would have used Google anyway, but Google recognizes the power of the default behavior. And they're like, you know what? It's still worth $12 billion for it to be the first thing. So that the thought doesn't even cross the person's mind
Totally.
to go somewhere else. I love it.
Yeah, another example, obviously, this is probably still very profitable, but it's not at this level. I've heard in some countries, I think it was in Asia or not, sorry, not in Asia, in Africa. Basically, Facebook made a deal. I don't know if it was a few years ago when Facebook was starting or is still happening now, but Facebook made a deal with a bunch of telco companies to basically have Facebook downloaded already on the site on the phone as soon as the user buys it and starts installing, which I thought it was a very clever deal.
I think they even went further and said that any usage of Facebook would actually be free. So they would pay for that data usage because yeah, it is a very interesting kind of technique, and it's kind of similar to a topic that you and I have covered previously called joint ventures, where you
Yeah.
kind of find like adjacent places. The reason why Apple is doing this is because it is not a conflict for them. If Apple had their own search engine, Google would not have tried to do this. So Google was very smart to figure out how do we find a partner where it's an offer they could not refuse, right? So
Totally. And to give another few examples of e-commerce that have applied this principle, this bias, the classic example is, let's say you're selling, vitamins, and you have three different quantities of one vitamin. You have 5 pounds quantity, 10 pounds, and 15, and then 20 and 25 pounds. Oftentimes, what you see is e-commerce selecting the highest quantity or the mid quantity as the default state for the user. Another example is when websites put recommended as the frequency of purchase whenever somebody wants to buy a product on a subscription basis. Even the default state of category page on bestsellers, so sorted by bestsellers versus I've tested, actually this is an interesting one, I've tested using sorting the products by the highest price first versus bestsellers, which it was a very interesting experiment. But this is a very, very, very powerful bias, and I just want to
I want to just add one more here. You
Yeah.
talked about an experiment. So I also ran an experiment, and you can tell me if this is an example of default bias or not. But this is for a Yahoo store. So, this is 5-6 years ago. But what happens when you start the checkout process, we ask for, your name, your email address, and the checkbox for signing up for deals is pre-selected, right? So is that example of a default? Is that a default state?
Yeah.
I'll tell you about the experiment that I ran, which I think is actually quite interesting. So in the experiment that I ran, so it was like sign up for discounts and promos. And what I did in my experiment was when someone unchecked it, because I was concerned about people unchecking it, we showed a warning, not a warning message, but a message below that in red font that said, people that subscribe to our newsletter save on average, $800 a year in savings. And what we noticed was, I can't remember the statistics, but I know that was a test winner because people unchecked it, they saw the warning message, and then they checked it again. So I just wanted to share that. So.
Yeah, and another interesting one that I remember reading about, Rishi, you love this one. I think it was done in Denmark or somewhere in the Nordics. Basically, by default, you had to opt in order to become a organ donor. Okay. What these guys have done is you had to opt out,
Yes.
right, in order to not donate your organ. And they saw like a huge increase in number of people that would donate their organ.
I think that's a really good point. I know that in the UK they have the behavioral economics unit where they kind of are nudging people, and I think they use these same techniques as well. So it's a really powerful technique. And it's also a safety mechanism, because if you think about it, for the user, the energy that they need to change the selected option to something else, it takes a lot more energy. It's lower energy to stick with that default selection, which is why it makes it less risky. Because this is the thing also, is that if they change it and if it's not the right choice, it's their fault. If they don't change it and it's not the right choice, it's the retailer's fault. And that's always what people would prefer, right? Awesome.
I'm going to give you another example, actually.
Love it.
One more of an experiment that I ran. And it didn't go well as expected. What happens is that and this is like very bad thing to do. Like I wouldn't redo it. This is not an advice I'm giving people. It was like a few years ago. But basically having subscribe and save. So this is like a direct to consumer brand that was selling a product on a subscription as well. And having auto ship and save as a default state for the choices. So it was a bad experiment from a result, like from an ideation standpoint, very, very bad. But from a result standpoint, it was even worse, because what happens is that a lot of people canceled instantly because they didn't realize that they bought the product on a subscription, because somehow from the design and from the UX, they couldn't really understand there was a difference. So it was, I would say, like a default bias when, wrong and bad example.
It's a really good point. Awesome. Well, we will see you guys back with yet another random idea that we'll pick from the world of e-commerce. If you like this content, please comment, please share it. Please share it with one person in your network who could benefit from it, and we'll see you again.